I grew up in central Wisconsin, outside of a town called Mosinee, and when I was in junior high into high school, that was also the time where Ojibwe people were starting to exercise their treaty rights. And so there was spearfishing going on throughout the state this time of year, after the ice broke. That time in the state was very volatile and hostile. There was overt racism and people who were getting death threats. There was violence. The next day in school, I had classmates that were at the boat landing, and they were not supporting the spearfishers. They were there protesting against the spearfishing. And at that night, the violence got so escalated that the Wisconsin National Guard got called in because there was gunfire and just the amount of hostility and violence that was taking place. Mosinee has and had then an Indian mascot. And here are my classmates at the boat landing protesting against Ojibwe people, real, live Indian people in the community exercising their sovereignty. When we're in conservation class and students talking about Indians and referring to them as timber niggers, in art class where kids want to create t-shirts that say, "Spear a pregnant squaw, save 2 walleye," and then having over the arch of the school, walking through the hall saying, "Welcome to Indian country." And now that I'm older and work in education, I think about that. And I think about what is my role to make sure that I can advocate for other people or stand with them, or how am I a good ally to another person?
Washington playing Dallas here tonight. It seems like an appropriate time to acknowledge the ongoing controversy about the name Redskins. Let's start here. There's no reason to believe that owner Daniel Snyder or any official or player from his team harbors animus toward Native Americans or wishes to disrespect them. This is undoubtedly also true of the vast majority of those who don't think twice about the long-standing moniker. And in fact, as best can be determined, even a majority of Native Americans say they are not offended. But having stipulated that, there's still a distinction to be made. Objections to names like Braves, Chiefs, Warriors, and the like strike many of us as political correctness run amok. These nicknames honor rather than demean. They're pretty much the same as Vikings, Patriots, or even Cowboys. And names like Blackhawks, Seminoles, and Chippewas, while potentially more problematic, can still be okay, provided the symbols are appropriately respectful. Which is where the Cleveland Indians, with the combination of their name and Chief Wahoo logo, have sometimes run into trouble. A number of teams, mostly in the college ranks, have changed their names in response to objections. The Stanford Cardinal and the Dartmouth Big Green were each once the Indians. The St. John's Redmen have become the Red Storm. And the Miami of Ohio Redskins, that's right, Redskins, are now the Red Hawks. Still, the NFL franchise that represents the nation's capital has maintained its name.
Native American mascots do not honor Native Americans. They are race-based stereotypes of American Indians that reduce them to one-dimensional caricatures. They demean our cultures, Native cultures, and they are a very poor educational policy. So in and of themselves, they teach children who are in schools that have these symbols to tolerate stereotyping of a racial group.
If we think about the National Congress of American Indians, which is a body of the civic leadership of the First Nations that are here in North America, in our nation, the United States of America. If we listen to the Great Lakes Intertribal Council, which is a body of civic leadership here in the Western Great Lakes, if we listen to the National Indian Education Association, a lot of tribal educators from all the different 567 Native American nations here in our country, locally, the Wisconsin Indian Education Association. If we think about all these elected leaders and their formal positions that they've issued on Native American mascots, I think when I think of do Native American mascots honor, I think about our civic leaders and our educational leaders and the positions and statements that they've reminded us about how most Native leadership thinks about Native American mascots. And they say they're harmful, they say they're problematic, and they wish they were condemned and retired. And so that's one place, the tribal leadership of this hemisphere issuing statements about the problems they see with Native American mascots, not necessarily honoring Native Americans, but often simplifying the great cultural and linguistic diversity of our continent into a kind of indigenous monoculture. So simplifying our continental linguistic and cultural diversity is a problem because that results in a stereotype.
I do not feel honored by Indian mascots, and as a Native person, I don't feel honored as a Native person when I see mascots. When I think about this issue and spend time talking about the issue, what really becomes clear is that we're talking about identity. When we're talking about what's happening in public schools, in public education, it's not simply a matter of opinion, it's a matter of public policy. And when a school has a race-based logo, like an Indian mascot, they're teaching how to stereotype, and they're teaching institutionally that it's okay to stereotype. And that's where I feel deeply that Native American mascots do not honor Native American people.
When Native people say that they do not feel honored and that is not respected, there's no way that when they talk about honoring, and that's certainly the statement that always comes out, the only people being honored by Native American mascots are Europeans, because it's a conquered image. When you hunt a bear or a deer and you put the trophy up on a wall, you're honoring the fact that you conquered something that fought back. So when you look at Native American mascots and you put them out in these constructed battlefields, which are football fields, what you're doing is you're replaying the conquering, you're replaying colonization, you're replaying that. And to expect that we can live in a multicultural democracy when there's a nation of people that are constantly reaffirmed that they have been colonized is ludicrous. So the way you honor American Indians is you look at authentic, living communities of American Indians. You look at the way that they create their traditions, the way that they create their practices, the way that those governments are run. That's what you honor, and you honor them in their specificity, not in this generic Plains Indian with the with the headdress, which completely perverts and takes out of context all the real understanding that we have of authentic American Indians. So no, what it does is it keeps us in the time of colonization to keep those mascots. They're a vestige of a time that we should be moving past.
I do not believe American Indian mascots honor Native Americans. The reason why I believe that is because of the harm and the negative stereotyping that occurs when people use those images and caricatures and names that involve American Indian peoples. I do know that some people don't necessarily agree with that opinion that I have, but looking at the empirical evidence that is out there, we do know that negative stereotyping of American Indian people as it pertains to American Indian mascots and logos, it creates harm for our populations.
Even as a young girl in Nebraska, whenever there were events where people would start doing this woo-woo-woo stuff, I was offended by it and ashamed at the same time. And I would cringe if I knew they were going to do something like that, because I knew it was disrespectful. And so this started my dislike of people trying to imitate what they thought were what Native people did. And so I have always not liked the whole idea of treating Indians as mascots, like a dog or a horse or another animal, which I think is fine because animals have different kinds of strengths, and I think that they display those and that they can depict a team, but not people, not Native people.
But think for a moment about the term Redskins and how it truly differs from all the others. Ask yourself what the equivalent would be if directed toward African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, or members of any other ethnic group. When considered that way, Redskins can't possibly honor a heritage or a noble character trait, nor can it possibly be considered a neutral term. It's an insult, a slur, no matter how benign the present-day intent. It's fair to say that
the American Psychological Association, the American Sociological Association have both issued formal statements that their research has said that Native American mascots are in fact harmful, not only for Native Americans but for non-Native Americans. So they create harm. And that's a challenge. You know, creating harm in an educational environment is the definition of institutional racism, and so that's something to take note of.
The American Association of Social Workers, school counselors, all to write resolutions and letters asking that race-based stereotyping of this nature be removed from our public schools. So this is an issue where American Indian people have been speaking out for years. We are less than 2% of the population. So even when we yell and shout and scream and make a lot of noise, sometimes it is not heard. There just aren't enough of our voices being heard. We need allies who are educated, who understand the issue, who are willing to see that even though they might be a sports fan for the Washington Slur team, that it's harmful to someone they know and care about, and that it is in fact a form of racial stereotyping that we're teaching in the schools. So if we can get more allies to understand this issue and to see it for what it is and not think of it as we're taking away some cherished symbol, but that we are teaching our children how to stereotype American Indians and other minority groups. We're teaching them how to do this in a hands-on fashion by maintaining these stereotypes.
Native Americans are upset at a Washington Post poll published Thursday, which claims that most Native people are not bothered by the team name and mascot of the Washington Redskins. The poll surveyed 504 Native American adults, 44% of whom said they are an enrolled member of a Native tribe. The poll asks, as a Native American, do you find that name offensive or does it not bother you? 90% of respondents said the name does not bother them. The Post also surveyed 340 self-identifying Native Americans about whether they thought the word redskin is disrespectful. 73% said they didn't think the word was disrespectful. However, leaders of the National Congress of American Indians, the Oneida Indian Nation, the United South and Eastern Tribes, and Native people using #IamNative, on Twitter were swift in voicing their skepticism of the poll's results.
Following this last election cycle, we know that polls don't necessarily result in how policy should be or how policy actually ends up being. The issue around mascots often starts as being something that is anecdotal or a conversation or I feel this way or I feel that way. Myself, I've talked with other Native people who didn't have an issue with mascots until we started talking a little bit deeper. And so with this issue, I feel it kind of reminds me of an onion. So there's kind of this surface issue and it's the, oh, I don't get it. I don't get it why this is, why does it bother Indians about having a mascot? They should be honored by this. On the flip side, as a Native person who doesn't feel honored by it and recognizes the impact on identity and how I view myself in the world, it's more than what a poll can really reflect. So if we were going to poll people on their opinion on the use of an Indian mascot, I think that's one very surface piece of information that we can look at. If I'm in charge of a school district, I'm going to hopefully recognize that my role goes much deeper and needs to include a lot more information than what a poll would bring forward.
Are they endangered? Yeah. I know tigers are.
Yeah, tigers are cool. Everything. Mascots, you know.
I'm kind of interested in who they surveyed to get that number. I know I wasn't asked. They're no longer endangered. They've been taken off.
Are they really?
Well, as a methodologist, and I'm someone that teaches research methods, I looked at that ad. It was from 2016. And first of all, you can critique it on methodological grounds. There were 540 people in that survey. Over half the people were over 50, and none of the people in the survey were under the age of 18, which meant that they missed a whole segment of the population that exist within schools that have mascots. So we can already look at the fact that there's not a significant amount of experience or direct exposure to mascots of the population given. It was not geographically diverse. For the most part, the survey was concentrated in people in the East Coast and not necessarily in parts of the country that have large tribal communities and well-established tribal governments. Thirdly, they did not ask if people were actively involved in a tribal community. All they said is, are you American Indian? It's not a construction of living American Indians in communities, practicing their traditions, practicing their culture, voting in tribal elections, voting for tribal representatives. The other reaction I would have to it, and I do wonder about the agenda of the Washington Post, giving a survey like this in the first place, given their support for their NFL football team, which they branded and which brings in several $1 billion a year, what difference would it make if a majority of the people think that there's nothing wrong with having a stereotype, a racial slur as a mascot? If you surveyed the United States in 1861, particularly the southern states, if you surveyed those states and said, what do you think of the institution of slavery? Most of the people surveyed would have said, I don't know anything else. So when I look at the survey, I see it as a distraction, and I see it as very politically motivated to further a narrative, to continue to fight resistance to the Washington NFL team.
The quote is from Ayn Rand, and she said that individual rights are not subject to a public vote. A majority has no right to vote away the rights of the minority. The political function of rights is precisely to protect minorities from oppression by majorities. And just because we have one school district in Wisconsin that feels that they're entitled to use some caricature of an American Indian as their mascot for whatever reason does not give them the right to discriminate against a minority, whether it's 15 people in Mukwonago or one person in the state of Wisconsin that self-identifies as an American Indian that finds this reprehensible.
And this issue is very much alive in all communities that still retain an Indian mascot. Since 1997, there have been 10 legislative attempts by Wisconsin Indian Education Association's Indian Mascot and Logo Task Force to change the law in Wisconsin so it would offer a pathway to eliminating race-based mascots that wouldn't involve school board members having to feel like they had to leave town because of the pressure that is put on them if they take a stand on the mascot issue, or school administrators to be forced out of communities when they have suggested that schools take a stand on that issue. And those are things that have happened here in the state of Wisconsin. School boards have been recalled several times, and school administrators have been forced out of their positions over this issue. So it's a very hot issue. People are proud of their high school teams, and they're proud of their high school experience. They don't want to hear that somehow or another this symbol is kind of like a Confederate flag or a Sambo's restaurant ad or an Aunt Jemima ad, that this is actually a form of stereotyping, and it's in the schools. They don't want to hear that. They want to keep their mascot. And over again, people will vote to keep their stereotypical mascot and force a family out of the community. And that is what has happened with the discrimination cases that have been brought forth in the state of Wisconsin. After the 2010 law, Act 250, was passed, 4 school districts changed at that time because they could, because the Department of Public Instruction was taking the heat by adjudicating the cases, and instead of school board members and school principals being forced out of communities or complainants being forced out of communities, it was possible to have the DPI say, no, this is inappropriate here, and here are the changes that need to be made.
We know that the research that's out there indicates that Native students perform lower on tests. We have students who are further being marginalized and stereotyped, and so it affects them, socially, emotionally, psychologically. And if our schools are really trying to prepare our students to be college, career, and community ready, then we really need to be aware of that.
In the cases I'm familiar with in which there's a racist mascot and a small minority of American Indians within those communities, what you see is massive alienation. Probably more so when the American Indian students in these communities fight it. They try to stop it. They call attention to it. And when the authorities refuse to acknowledge what they're saying and what they're fighting for, I think that's when you see the strongest alienation. You can't fight for the land and pretend that you ignore the mascots. It's all part of one fight. And to minimize it and say that mascots are symbolic and something that's not important is ignoring the holistic nature of what colonization is.
Young people really need to learn about it early on, because it's surprising how many adults have the stereotypes of Native people in their minds, and they teach their children, and their children teach their children. Like we talk about generations and things continue, and they do. I mean, how do we ever get to know each other unless we learn about each other?
So that's why the governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper, appointed this panel of Native Americans in schools to come up with a solution, the recommendation. Eliminate all American Indian mascots, images, and names. If a school does not, a federally recognized tribe should approve the logo or the mascot. So those 30 Colorado schools that use Indian mascots include Lamar High Savages and the Eaton Reds, where student Carol Lee said, hey, quote, Native Americans were persecuted for so many years. For us to have the nerve to continue to have the mascot, well, it just hurts the soul.
Adidas has announced an initiative that aims to help remove Native American mascots from high schools. The apparel maker says it will offer financial and design resources to schools looking to remove Native American mascots, nicknames, imagery, or symbolism. The voluntary program would offer schools access to the company's design team for logo redesign and uniform design, as well as a means to pay for the changes. Some have already taken action against using such mascots. In 2012, the Oregon State Board of Education banned the use of Native American mascots, while Stanford switched their mascot from Indians to Cardinal in 1972.
We don't want to take your mascots away from you. What we want you to do is to find mascots that don't harm any human being.
This is an issue that we must talk about in society because it affects all of our children.
Native American mascots should not operate within these environments. It remains an incredibly salient and important topic considering how many Native American mascots are still present within educational institutions that are funded by state and federal governments in some way. So, if our own kind of public institutions kind of maintain harmful environments, we can only call that some sort of form of institutional racism.
The measures indicated, self-esteem, self-efficacy, and other measures investigated are correlates of student achievement and student attainment. There's a potential negative impact that this research documents on the mental health of all students, particularly American Indian students. Stereotyping of American Indians, when incorporated as official practice of school districts, interferes with that school district's efforts to provide accurate, authentic instruction on the history, culture, and tribal sovereignty of the federally recognized tribes and bands in this state.
People don't necessarily think that the folks that love their Indian mascots are doing it because they hate real Indians. We know that you're not trying to do that. We just ask for a little respect and just to take a step back and take a look at what actual harm this is doing, because it is doing harm, it's quantifiable, and the evidence is there.
As I listened to that testimony, I changed my mind. After 35 years of defending this, I learned from the Native Americans themselves that it was wrong what we were doing.
We have kids in our schools who are being impacted by these pieces of imagery, and it's not just Native kids that are being impacted by this, or Native communities or Native families, it's everybody.
There is research that shows that when students are exposed to an American Indian mascot, they have a greater tendency to stereotype people from another minority group. So now it doesn't just affect the 2% who are American Indian, it also affects all of the other minority groups in your school.
I think that they continue to reinforce the stereotypes that are out there about Native Americans. I mean, a lot of people still hold these stereotypes and hold us to their depictions in movies, videos, all kinds of media, what Native American people are like, that they murder, that they destroy. People need to know the real stories about the tribes of this country and what they've gone through. We really suffered genocide in this country from way, way back. From the first time they set shores on our southern coast down there near Puerto Rico and the other countries of the Caribbean, where they killed so many Native people. And the thing is that some of these depictions are still shown in some of the things they have out there that they think are representative of Native American people. I am just appalled at the lack of history that people know that go through high school and through college of their country. We could benefit from teaching more of our own history to our young people from a very early age.
Yes, it's connected to everything else. If we're fighting colonization, and we are fighting it at an international level, everyone has heard of Standing Rock. That became a headline. But it's reflective of battles that are going on all over the world, in which Indigenous people are fighting for their traditions, are fighting for their institutions, are fighting for their culture, are fighting for their land. We want land restored to American Indians. We want their institutions made stronger. We also want the cultural appropriation to end. American Indians have the right to self-determine all of their identity. They have the right to take back their images, their cultural traditions. They have the right to assert and have strong institutions, and they have the right to their land.
there are still 31 schools in Wisconsin, 31 school districts that still retain an American Indian mascot, logo, or retain some parts of a logo or mascot, some Indian reference in their sports team branding. There really is no downside to changing. What's happening is you're giving your students a chance at having good school spirit without harming the student body.
Officially, Indian country opposes any race-based mascots, logos, and images, officially.
At every State of the Tribes address, our leadership reminds us that they still take issue with Native American mascots and that they hope we resolve this issue in some way going forward. If the elected leadership of Native Americans have condemned them, Native American mascots, as problematic, and if the national mental health research bodies have described them as harmful, then who are we listening to in regards to Native American mascots?